Just to kind of let you know where we've been at in the Bible lately, we started looking through the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew, he was one of Jesus' 12 closest disciples. He was a tax collector in his background, kind of hated by the Jewish people and a friend of the Romans, which didn't go over so well. But Jesus had a really eclectic group of 12 people, some polar opposites in that group. And Matthew gives us a great picture of some of the elements of Jesus' life. And when Matthew introduces Jesus, he really presents Jesus as this king, and this king who has a kingdom. And when Jesus is on earth, that kingdom starts to become a reality because people's lives are transformed around him. And there's this future hope, this time where the Bible predicts the return of this King Jesus. But until then, there's still a way in which we, as followers of Christ, can help to build elements of that into the world around us. I kind of like the last line of that song, the last few lines where it said, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is heaven. And that's kind of that idea. We haven't arrived there yet. We're not in the presence of God's glory. We're still here on this earth, and it's filled with its imperfections and flaws and difficulties, maybe even daily. But there are ways that as followers of Jesus, we can bring pieces of that kingdom, that heaven that we look forward to, into the here and now, into people's lives. And people can see Jesus transform their lives here and now, and bring healing, and bring a different perspective, and bring life, and bring hope. And so that's what we're looking at as we go through this gospel. This picture that Matthew presents of Jesus is he's this king of this kingdom. And this king is like no other king that you've ever met before. So let me calm your hearts with that, because we all know people who are in positions of power and leadership. And sometimes it seems like the higher up you go in leadership, the more distanced you actually get from the people. The more disconnected, and maybe the more corrupted even by the power and the authority that you wield. But this Jesus is not like that. We learned already in Matthew's gospel how Jesus, he's an inclusive king. He's a king who brings imperfect people along for the journey. He is a king who values women and brings them in to the journey. He's a king who draws people from different nations and nationalities and cultures and brings them into the journey. And so this church is not supposed to look like any one thing or one person. It's supposed to have diversity. We learned how this king, if you believe the words of Matthew, this king was divine, was God in the flesh. Last week we took a look at how this king was unexpected, and sometimes your reactions to Jesus are going to reflect that. In Jesus' time, some people were concerned because they didn't know what this king was like. Herod, who was a king locally at the time, got competitive, and we'll learn more about him today. And then these Magi, these wise men who came from the east, probably present-day Iran and the Persian Empire, or the Parthian Empire at that time, they were celebrating Jesus. And so we react in different ways. But people didn't expect Jesus to come in the way he did as a king. Today we're going to look at one more aspect of Jesus as king. And that's how he's a king who's kind of uprooted. And maybe you've gone through similar experiences in your own life. I had a friend who, after spending nearly a decade of his life serving in the Air Force, for part of that time he flew around the world with a team of people securing United States planes in hostile locations around the globe. And then for the second half of his service, he guarded nuclear weapons and headed a team of people that kept nuclear weapons safe in the country. So that was his military life. And after a lot of prayer and soul searching, he and his wife, they made the decision to go into civilian life again. And he found a job with a company. It was an international corporation. They offered him a position with a security team that was on an international level, so right down his alley, right consistent with his training. And about 3 or 4 months after that, due to COVID, the company decided to eliminate his position. And so he and his wife and their 2 daughters had just transitioned out of military life into civilian life, had a good paying job, and all of a sudden the rug got pulled out from underneath them. And they had moved across the country from where they were serving in the military to a totally new place, gotten immersed in that. And so he asked around and eventually found a job a little while later with a different company about 3 or 4 miles away. So again, they packed their family up. They moved 3 or 4 miles away to a different major city. He started another job. And a few months after that, he discovered that there were some very questionable things happening within that company, the way that people were treated, employees were managed, and he felt like he couldn't continue on in good conscience with that company. And so, again, he had to find a different job, and he ended up bouncing somewhere else with his family, doing pharmaceutical sales, of all things, after a time in the Air Force doing anything but that. But that's what he had to do, and it seemed like that was the journey that God had him on. And it gets really confusing sometimes when our life gets uprooted in ways like that. But we learned from Jesus, his experience was very similar. And maybe you feel like your life has been subject to unexpected change. Maybe you're in the midst of it right now and you don't know what the next steps are and you can't predict that, what God's going to do next. And you wonder, why? I just want to encourage you today that Jesus, he can relate because he's been there too. We're going to look at an aspect of Jesus today that we don't think about a lot, but he was a displaced king. He was an uprooted king. His circumstances suddenly changed, just like yours maybe have, just like mine maybe have as well. So we're going to look at that story of how this happened in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 23 today. So if you'd like to follow along in Bibles, you're certainly welcome to do that. We'll have verses on the screen behind me, or you can just sit back and listen for a few minutes this morning as we learn about this aspect of Jesus and what he went through. And Jesus, what he experienced was even to a deeper level than what my friend experienced, because my friend experienced a change of circumstances, but Jesus actually experienced a threat to himself, even to his very life. Matthew 2, it continues on in verse 13. It says, when they had gone, who's they? They are the wise men, the Magi, who had come from the east and just left gifts with Jesus and his family. And I think this is kind of a key way to introduce this, because before the Magi arrived, we know something about Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and that was that they were impoverished at this point in time. We don't know what entirely led up to that. Maybe it was a dowry that Joseph might have paid Mary's father for their wedding. Maybe it was this sudden trip to Jerusalem area, to Bethlehem, to take part in the census and pay taxes as a result of that. But whatever the case was, when they went to offer sacrifices after Jesus' birth at the temple, they could only afford a couple of doves. They couldn't offer lamb or more reasonable sacrifices that might have set them back $75 to $150 in today's currency. They could only afford a few bucks to sacrifice to the Lord. And this is for Jesus here, right? And so they were impoverished. They wouldn't have been able to handle what was about to happen to them had the Magi not come and dropped off these very, very practical gifts. Gold, easily converted into liquid cash, used for cash a lot of places in that society. Frankincense, which was an incense, which was highly tradable. And myrrh, which was used for embalming, especially in Egypt and those areas. So very, very easy assets to turn into cash and to buy things of need with. And so God provided that. And he knew. He did that kind of preemptively. When they had gone, as soon as they left, and again, they left with these timely gifts. It says, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up. So the Magi leave. Maybe that night, Joseph falls asleep. In the middle of the night, an angel comes to him in this dream. Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you. Everything just settled down. They were in Nazareth. They had to go to Bethlehem. They were there for some period of time. We don't know, a few weeks to a few months, perhaps, up to a year and a half or so. Had family in the area, kind of got restabilized. And all of a sudden, in one moment, after this great day of celebration, when these unexpected gifts show up, God speaks to Joseph in a dream and says, I want you to flee to Egypt, back into the unknown, with your young family, your wife, your infant, and everything change. It's going to come back upon you. You're going to be displaced from everything that you're familiar with and everything that you know. God pressed him to take this child and immediately go to a different country. And so again, this is more than a job loss. He and his family were about to become refugees. We don't think about Jesus as a refugee, but he spent time in a foreign land because of a threat that was coming his way. I want to tell you a little bit about what an organization called Preemptive Love. It's an organization that works to provide relief on the front lines of conflict. They try to eliminate violence and exploitation of people. They aid asylum seekers in some of the most war-torn regions of the world. They made some really good comments that I think help transport us into the mind of a refugee and what refugees go through. And I think it's important for us to kind of step into that realm, because most of you are not in an imminent threat. Most of you tonight won't have a reason to abandon everything that you call familiar and home and take yourself and your family and flee to another country. That probably won't happen. It's kind of hard for us to relate. And so let me help you step into that mindset of what people experience in these situations and what Jesus and his family to some degree probably experienced as well. This is what they say. There's a couple of stories and a little bit of information. Khadijah and her family had to flee their home in Syria as ISIS arrived at their front door. This happened just a few years ago, burning each house in their village to the ground. Can you imagine that? Somebody shows up in your subdivision and they start burning house after house after house. It's the middle of the night and you see what's coming. Everything your family had worked for, everything they'd saved up, everything they had built, a home, a life, and their dreams, was instantly gone. Safety is all that matters under such circumstances. Leaving home is not a decision a person makes lightly. It's something that's thrust upon them. And that was the case with Mary and Joseph and Jesus. They were forced to make a decision, and that was survive or die. Another refugee said, we don't have a vision for the future. Before, when we were in Syria, we thought about our future, how it would be, how we wanted it to be for our kids. But now they don't. The future is kind of this blank slate, this static. Another refugee named Shireen said, I want to live today and I want to live tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, we'll think about it when it comes. So they take one day at a time. And that's the mindset, and maybe that was the mindset of Mary and Joseph and Jesus at this time. It says, think about the pain of being unable to dream. No plan or vision for the future, just surviving today to make it through till tomorrow. Your home is gone. Your hope to return one day, but you're not sure that you ever will. And that's the life of a refugee. You're just focused on survival. Every day brings a new battle. There's 25.9 million people today that are living that reality, the reality of a refugee. And that's, again, this reality that Mary and Joseph and Jesus were thrust into at this moment in time. That's, if you take the population of Washington State, Oregon State, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, and you combine them, that's the number of people who have been forced out of their own countries. Again, mainly because of war and conflict, genocide and things like that. And that's people today who are living this life, again, that Jesus was entering into. And a lot of times God, I think in his grace, he prompts people to escape and flee those situations. And he sent this angel in a dream to Joseph. And I can imagine being Mary. You get woken up by your husband in the middle of the night and he says, I had this dream. God told me we're going to leave the country right now. Can you imagine selling that to your spouse if you're married today? I had this dream, we got to leave right now. But I think there's a lot of people in the world who have felt that urgency. I don't know what it is, but I feel prompted. I don't know if it's God. I don't know if it's my intuition, but I feel like we've got to go. And so they go. And then tragedy strikes after that. But there's a threat, and they're able to perceive that. And here's the threat in the next phrase that was up against Jesus. The angel said, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So Herod, the king of the area, was about to try to kill Jesus. And there's a lot of people who are trying to kill other people today. Most refugees currently come from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. And that's where war and genocide have been rampant in some places for, nearly a decade or more. It says, so Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night, and he left for Egypt. So they started traveling in the middle of the night. They probably just had essentials with them, and undoubtedly the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that they were given the day before. And it says in verse 15, he stayed there, Joseph did, with his family until the death of Herod. This happened so what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. This is a quote from a small book called Hosea in the Old Testament, in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. And it's interesting that Matthew would refer back to that. Matthew is a gospel that he's trying to prove that Jesus is this long-awaited king that Israel's been waiting for, this deliverer, this savior. And so he goes back to the Old Testament again and again to show these moments where God has alluded to what things would be like when this king would show up. And Hosea chapter 11, it's actually a throwback. It points back to a time when Israel was enslaved in Egypt. And through Moses, God called out the Israelites from Egypt. And he calls Israel his son at that point in time in history. And so it's sort of, in a second sense, in a literal sense, not only did God bring his nation, his son, so to speak, out of Egypt, but now God is actually bringing his only begotten son, Jesus Christ, out of Egypt. And so it's perhaps a second way to interpret that prophecy in the book of Hosea. But the point is that Jesus, he understands what it's like to be displaced, to have all the circumstances change in a moment, to have challenges. Maybe he faced cultural challenges or language barriers. Maybe there was difficulty finding housing or work. Or maybe things were a little more familiar than what you would predict, because there was actually a pretty large Jewish population in Egypt at the time. And so maybe what he did was gravitate toward people of his own culture that he found. But I think whatever the case, one, it helps us realize that Jesus cares and he's concerned, and he knows what it's like to have everything changed in a moment, to be displaced from everything that you call familiar. But it also helps us step into the mind of people who are experiencing similar things today. You can imagine how if you were displaced from your own country and you showed up in a strange country trying to seek refuge, that it would be a difficult adjustment. And so maybe it's helpful, maybe your natural inclination would be to find small pockets of people from your own culture that were already in that country. I know that there are actually people from Afghan refugees currently in the Salt Lake City area, and there are organizations that are trying to bring more people who are currently being housed on U.S. military bases into the Salt Lake area, because not only are there people there that are willing to help them adapt, find jobs, learn languages, enroll kids in school and those things, but there's also a small community of Afghans already living in the area, some of whom are refugees, some of whom are U.S. citizens or nationals or people living here. And so you can imagine how it'd be helpful to have a few people who are familiar with your culture and a few people from the culture to which you're entering into to help you kind of bridge the gap between everything that you've been familiar with and this whole new reality. We don't know how long Jesus was in Egypt. It could have been a few weeks or a few months up to a few years, because the timelines allow for either thing. But it sounds like it was a decent enough period of time, and they had to get adjusted to a whole new normal in this situation, because there was a tragedy that was going to happen, and God had allowed them to avoid that. And so I want to take a few moments and talk about that tragedy and what happened. In November of 2019, there were some gunmen that opened fire on a caravan of 3 vehicles in northern Mexico. Maybe you heard about those things on the news a couple of years ago. They were headed to a wedding, and 70 miles south of the U.S. border, very likely were, again, assaulted by a cartel. Perhaps it was a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps it was a case of the families competing with the cartels for water rights and other things in the area, or some conflict that had happened between those 2 groups in the past. But whatever the cause, tragically, 3 women and 6 children lost their lives, and several others were wounded in those attacks. And that was a tragic event. And that was something that even struck a chord, because some of the people that were involved were related to my extended family on my wife's side. And so this close-knit community of people, a small close-knit community of U.S. and Mexican dual citizens in northern Mexico, they were affected in ways that they'll never be able to forget. They'll never be the same. And there was a similar tragedy that was aimed at Jesus, but again, he had been taken out of the way, but other people were tragically victims of that in Bethlehem. And that was at the hands of this king, King Herod. We learned about last week, Herod was a pretty paranoid person, and he had actually, over his time on the throne, he had one of his wives and 3 of his kids executed because he thought they were trying to push against him or maybe usurp his power. He was very paranoid. He was very proud. And it says in verse 16, when he saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, this is a king who's used to getting his way. This is not the king like the King Jesus that you're meeting. This is the king that you would fear in the world. This is the dictator that you would want nothing to do with. It says when he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged. And the idea behind that in the Greek language is that he felt that the Magi had made a complete mockery of him by failing to report back. How dare you not do what I said? How dare you not come back to me and tell me the whereabouts of this king? How dare you disrespect my authority? And he became so enraged, it says, he sent men and he killed all the boys who were in Bethlehem and its vicinity, who were 2 years old and younger, based on the time that he had determined from the Magi. Again, that this Christ child, this new baby king, had been born. So he was fueled by rage, and he ordered the murder of every boy 2 and under in Bethlehem. W.F. Albright, who was an archaeologist and some years ago, he did some extensive research on populations at that point in time in Palestine, and his best guess is that Bethlehem had about 300 residents in that village at this point in time in history. And so perhaps maybe 10 to 15 young boys, 10 to 15 families out of maybe 50 or 60 families were affected. So much like this tragedy that happened in northern Mexico, a very small, close-knit group of people, 300 people, most of whom were extended family with each other, 1 out of every 5 families lost a child in that event. And it was tragic, and it was something that they would never recover from. It says in verse 17, then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. Fulfilled again, we might say. This is what Jeremiah said. He said, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. So the big picture of what's happening in that statement is that there's mourning that's happening. You can imagine the mourning and the grief that's happening when the king sends his soldiers in and these families lose their young children, their infants or their toddler boys. So there's mourning. But it's a throwback to a couple of places in history. One is with Rachel. Rachel's in the book of Genesis, early in the Old Testament. And Rachel and Leah, they were both wives. And Rachel had a difficult time bearing children. Eventually, Joseph became her son, and she also gave birth to Benjamin, and she died in childbirth in that instance. But for many, many years, she was unable to have children, and that grieved her because she was childless. And Jeremiah refers back to that experience in his day because Jerusalem had been surrounded by the Babylonian Empire. And they ransacked the city, they destroyed Jerusalem, and they took the people that they took captive. A lot of times it was the kids, the younger people, the healthier people. Sometimes families were separated. They drew all the captives, those who were still alive, and they separated them and they put them in this city called Ramah, which is 5 miles north of Jerusalem. And that was where they gathered them before they marched them over to Babylon into captivity to deport them from their country. And so Jeremiah is saying, just like Rachel grieved being childless, people in my day will grieve their sons and daughters being deported to a strange land, taken as captives and sent to Babylon. And Matthew is saying in that same way, people in this same area are mourning yet again, like Rachel did, like the mothers who lost their kids to the deportation did. Again, mourning is happening in this area. It seems like mourning is one of the tragic experiences of life because it's a corrupt and a sinful place. And sometimes people do things that are completely senseless, and other people are affected by that. And I would say any time that there is some kind of displacement, maybe it's a lighter level, maybe there's just a change of circumstances, or maybe it's a little bit deeper where, you lose a job or you have to relocate to a different place and a lot of things change. Or maybe it's a tragic loss that happens in life. Or maybe it's one of these events that should never happen, where women or children, people who are completely maybe helpless or innocent, are completely taken away from life too early. Whatever the degree of those circumstances, I think there's a time for mourning and there should be grieving. And one of the things that I see is that we don't take time to grieve and to mourn enough. We try to move on. We try to have a stiff upper lip. But there can actually be a benefit to mourning a loss and going through a time of deep grief and tragedy. And thankfully for Mary and Joseph and Jesus, that period of kind of limbo didn't last forever. And a lot of times God brings us around in life to resettle us, like he did with my friend who now, again, found a job, found a home for his family, and a job that's a lot more stable that he's been in since that period of time. And that's what's happening in the last few verses of today. There's a transition, and it's for the better, for Jesus, for Mary and Joseph. It says in verse 19, when Herod died, so this ruthless, unpredictable king died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who have sought the child's life are dead. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, so Jesus and Mary, and came into the land of Israel. So again, God shows up to him and allows his family to return to stability. You're able to come back. But there's a little concern for Joseph. It says in verse 22, when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee. So God spoke again to Joseph through 2 dreams and told him, go back, but when you go back, avoid the area that you were in. Judea is southern Israel, Samaria is central Israel, and Galilee, as we know, where Jesus spent a lot of his life in ministry, where Nazareth is, the city where he was raised, is in northern Israel. And over the middle and the southern portion of Israel Archelaus, one of Herod's sons, Archelaus, was ruler. And Archelaus was a pretty ruthless person, unpredictable, kind of like his dad. Let me just give you a moment of history on Archelaus to give you an idea of what they were dealing with and why Joseph might not have wanted to end up there. Shortly before his dad Herod the Great, died, the one who had these babies killed, Archelaus and Herod, there was an experience that happened in Jerusalem at the temple. Now, the great temple in Jerusalem, of which only the foundation is currently left, that was one of Herod's building projects, Herod the Great, who murdered these innocents in Bethlehem. And shortly before he died, he had a golden eagle erected at the entrance to the temple. The eagle was a symbol of the Roman Empire. And the Jews didn't really enjoy seeing that golden eagle every time they walked in to worship their God. And so there were 2 teachers and about 40 youth that decided to hack it down, chop down the pole that supported it one day. And that enraged Herod. And so he had those people executed shortly before he died. And Archelaus, he wanted to kind of patch things up with the Jewish people because they hated his father Herod. And so he put himself in his brightest white robe, and he put himself on a gold throne in Jerusalem, and he had the people come up to him, and he explained, I want to be kind, I want to be benevolent, I want to listen to your concerns, I don't want to persecute you politically like my father Herod did. And then a few people in the audience started to complain and ask him about this murder of those 42 people who chopped down the golden eagle statue, and they started to complain about that. And Herod's son, Archelaus, got more and more angry, and people started to get riled up, and so he called in the military, and this kind, benevolent new king had 3,000 people massacred in the temple that day. Not off to a good start. And that would have been the news that traveled to Joseph down in Egypt. So not the kind of person that you want to have as your ruler. Eventually, Caesar Augustus took Archelaus out of that position of kingship a few years later because there was so much cruelty that was happening. The Roman emperor deposed him and put up another ruler, a Roman ruler, in his place and did away with his throne. So that was the kind of person that Joseph was hoping to avoid, and that God said, you need to not go there. So again, they resettled in Galilee, in the city of Nazareth. It says, they came and settled in Nazareth. This happened so that what was spoken to the prophets would be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. And so he's back in Nazareth, Mary's hometown. We know that from Luke. That was where Mary was at when she found out that she would be giving birth to this Christ child, this King, this Savior. So back in familiar area, finally once again. There's a little bit of ambiguity behind that phrase, he'll be called a Nazarene. But the best explanations that I can find, because it's not a direct prophecy or quote from the Old Testament, Nazarenes, people from Nazareth, were kind of despised. It was like you're from that small country hick town that's not quite maybe as religious as it should be in this empire. And so people thought good things don't come from there. And there are a few scriptures in Psalms and Isaiah that talk about how Jesus would be despised. And so a lot of scholars think that's the connection that's being made here. That perhaps it's because he would be despised, and it would indicate that fact of how he'd be handled. There's also a part of Nazareth, the root of that word means branch, and this future king was also called a branch of Jesse, the father of King David, so a shoot that would come up out of their family lineage, and so maybe that's another reference. But again, there's some ambiguity to that phrase, but that's where he ended up settling. So he returned to stability, and God spoke to them in a dream, and they settled them in Galilee again. So it's kind of a crazy journey. But Jesus and his family, they know what it's like to go through that. And I know some of you in here have gone through your own crazy journeys. You ended up here, and that's where you're at now. And maybe for some of you, you don't know what steps are next. You know, you're still in limbo, and you're looking for what God has next. I can't tell you what God has next, but I can tell you that he knows what it's like, because Jesus has been there. He's gone there too. I want to just wrap things up today by giving us a few ways that we might be able to use some of the things that we talked about personally, or questions that we might be able to think about in our own lives. The first thing I put on these assessments and actions, are you currently being or feeling displaced? Maybe you are. You feel like you've been uprooted and you're in the land of unfamiliarity and all your plans got wiped away. All your future kind of is up in the air. And if so, understand, again, God's aware of your circumstances. And know, too, that this church community is here to help support you in ways that we can. And so feel free to let us know if that's you. And there are certain ways that we can help you kind of in this place in life that you're in. Secondly, is God in his justice directing you to give of your resources to lessen someone's suffering or meet a basic need or help somebody who is kind of in limbo, like he did with the Magi, with the wise men? Maybe that's how God will use you in this process. Thirdly, there's actually an organization in Salt Lake City, if you want to get further involved with helping people who are in that status of refugee, who are in our state. And so if so, I have some more information in your bulletin, on the back of your bulletin about that. It's called the International Rescue Committee, and there are different ways to get involved. Some of it is giving or supporting or collecting items, and some of it is hands-on, where you can actually get involved with helping people adjust to being here in the state of Utah who are refugees from Afghanistan. And so to whatever degree you want, there's ways to step in that water if you'd like to get involved personally. Fourth, how do you respond when other people don't do things your way? Are you like Herod and you just get enraged? I can't believe they would not, And obviously he took it to a degree that hopefully we won't go, murdering babies. But do we get angry when people don't do things our way? Maybe. Have you suffered a tragedy that you need to mourn? Because some of you have, but maybe you haven't taken time to grieve, or you've just tried to ignore what's happened. I invite you to mourn. Lastly, is there a need for you to seek God's next steps for your family in a time of transition? Maybe that's you now, and you've tried to figure things out on your own, but you've never asked God for direction. Maybe that's something you could try today. But all these things are ways that we can take this story, this experience that Jesus and his family went through, and make it personal and kind of grow our understanding of people as a result. Let's go ahead and pray today. God, I thank you for this community of people and for bringing us together. And I pray that you would have spoken to each one of us today in different ways. There's a lot of different angles, and I feel like a lot of us are at different places on this journey or in different places of being able to offer support to people who are. And so I pray that you would challenge us to respond in whatever way you desire today, and that we would be obedient to that, that we would be your hands and feet in this world, and that we would put our hope in you and turn to you for direction and realize that this church community is more than just a place to show up on Sunday. It's a place where we help each other through these challenges in life as well, and turn to people here if we need to as well. In Christ's name, amen.